record.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and call this session to order on housing during the time of COVID-19 roundtable. Let's go ahead and start with a roll call.
Mr. Rivera.
Present.
Ms. Quinn Davidson.
Here.
Ms. Allard.
Here.
Mr. Constant.
Here.
Mr. Dunbar.
Here.
Miss Kennedy.
Here.
Miss LaFrance.
Here.
She is here. Oh, there we go.
Here. Getting.
Mr. Perez Verdilla. Mr. Peterson.
Present.
Mr. Weddleton.
Here.
Miss Zalatel.
Here.
You have a quorum, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. So this is the second of 4 roundtables the Assembly will be hosting over the next week to continue to inform our COVID-19 response. Just a few minutes ago, we completed the first meeting, the business roundtable. Housing has forced itself in a big way into the national dialogue during this pandemic. We heard yesterday from Bill Popp, President and CEO of the Anchorage Economic Development Corporation, about some of his concerns regarding the housing market. And actually, I just noticed there was an article in the ADN with some of those same concerns. Today, we have a series of panels to dive deep into these and other issues around housing. I look forward to hearing from our panelists and seeing how they can inform the work we will be doing over the next few weeks and months. Before I go into the agenda, and my colleagues have heard this already, but I want to state the obvious. We could spend all day on this topic and hold a separate 3-hour meeting on each of the panels we are hearing today. This is certainly not meant to be the end of our exploration, but a place for us to start collectively as an assembly before we begin exploring and fashioning our own ideas. With that, I'm going to go ahead and go through the agenda for today's housing roundtable. So once I am done, we are going to begin our discussion with changes in the affordable housing market. And we have approximately 35 minutes set aside for that discussion. And we have familiar faces. So we have Gabe Lehman, who is the Chief Operating Officer at Cook Inlet Housing Authority, who will be joining us. And apologies if I mispronounce anyone's names. Then we have Chris Kolarek, Director of Public Policy and Government Affairs with Cook Inlet Housing Authority. Then we have Daniel Delfino, the Director of Planning and Program Development at Alaska Housing Finance Corporation. Then we also have Rob Marks, the Senior Team Lead on Housing with RollCap, as well as Patrick Anderson, the CEO at RollCap. Then we'll move on to another discussion about changes in the real estate and housing construction markets. For that, we will have Joshua Nelson, a board member of the Board of Realtors, as well as Drew Kaysen, the Government Affairs Director at the Anchorage Home Builders Association. Then we'll finish off with a discussion on landlord and tenant issues, as well as going into a little more details on the Rental Assistance Fund. So we have Nicole Nelson, the Executive Director of the Alaska Legal Services Corporation, Michael Patterson, the Chair of the Anchorage Tenants Union, Ryan Schmidinger, the Regional Director of Widener Apartments, and Greg Serbana, the Vice President of Public Relations at Widener Apartments. We have Cassandra Taggart, the President of the Landlord's Almanac. And then to talk about the Rental Assistance Fund, another group of familiar faces, Chris Schutte with the Office of Economic Development, and Jason Bockenstad, Chief of Staff to the Mayor. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started with our discussion on affordable housing markets and the changes, both current and future changes to the market. And we'll go ahead and start with our presenters from Cook Inlet Housing Authority, Gabe and Chris.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, members of the Assembly. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you again this time with a focus on what's happening in the affordable housing market at present. I am Gabe Lehman, the Chief Operating Officer for Cook Inlet Housing. I'm joined by Chris Kolarek, who is our Director of Public Policy and Government Affairs For background, Cook Inlet Housing owns and operates about 1,500 units of rental housing here in the municipality. We're an active developer of affordable and mixed income housing, both in the municipality and beyond. The vast majority of our rental portfolio serves individuals earning between about 30 and 80% of area median income. And for reference, area median income in Anchorage is about $58,000 a year for a couple and somewhere around $72,000 a year for a family of four. So really appreciate the opportunity to highlight what's happening in the affordable housing market. We'll share a little bit of our expectations for the months ahead and offer some high-level feedback about the opportunities that the municipality has to ensure that residents can continue to access safe and affordable housing as we navigate this crisis. So we'll jump right into it. What's going on? To no one's surprise, the need for affordable housing in our community is increasing, particularly among households with lower income workers who have been affected by the pandemic. Despite closing our own offices during the month of April and only accepting applications through a Dropbox process, Cook Inlet Housing actually experienced a 25% increase in applications in April over the prior 3-month period. Notably, our staff is reporting that they're fielding a substantially greater number of inquiries from residents with pretty decent employment histories who have never before sought to access affordable housing. Also, to no one's surprise, many current residents of affordable housing are finding it very difficult to pay their rent. We compared data on the total unpaid rent across our portfolio at the end of April 2019 and compared it to what we saw at the end of this past April 2020. And we found that unpaid rents have increased by just over 12% compared to a year ago. Doesn't seem like a catastrophic number, but I do have to emphasize that this is a pretty big deal in Anchorage because much of our affordable housing was developed under the federal low-income housing tax credit program. Unlike some other forms of affordable housing, the low-income housing tax credit program does not receive any kind of an ongoing operating subsidy. These are developments that are partially debt financed based upon the below market rate rents that tenants do pay. And so when those tenants aren't able to pay their rents, the low-income housing tax credit property can't meet its debt service obligations. And this is essentially just similar to any other multifamily property being unable to pay its mortgage. Interestingly, we've observed that our senior households have been substantially less impacted than our families. Most of our seniors have reasonably fixed incomes, and nearly all of them have been able to pay their rent in May, which is wonderful. But our families are struggling. In April, only 69% of our families paid their rent. That figure has jumped up a little bit this month, the month of May, to about 75%. But that's largely, we think, because of stimulus payments and a lot of extra work that our team's doing to connect residents to various community resources. Our families are definitely impacted by what's occurring in the economy, but our observation is that the lack of available childcare is definitely preventing families who can work and who want to work from returning to employment. If we can't address childcare, there are going to be significant spillover effects for our economy and the ability of our frontline workers to make the rental payments that are needed for low-income housing tax credit properties to satisfy their debt service obligations. A major saving grace that we've seen in Anchorage has been that the Alaska Housing Finance Corporation rapidly and proactively increased their support for Section 8 and project-based voucher holders very early on in this crisis. At Cook Inlet Housing, our residents have seen about an 8.7% total increase in that Alaska Housing Finance Corporation support from April to May. And it has been essential to the stability of our residents and our developments. And we greatly appreciate the Alaska Housing Finance Corporation acting so decisively in that manner. Simultaneously, affordable housing providers, in fact, almost all providers of rental housing, are experiencing increased operational costs due to COVID-19. We're talking about the need for enhanced janitorial and disinfecting, PPE usage, and costs associated with social distancing measures. In the past 2.5 months alone, Cook Inlet Housing has tracked about $400,000 in additional unanticipated costs related to COVID-19. These, to be very clear, are not short-term issues. We anticipate the increased need for affordable housing and ability of families to pay their rent and increased operational costs to persist for many months. Certainly into the fall, if the school district is not able to reopen full-time for in-person schooling, and for many families throughout the winter and into the next tourism season, when hopefully we do see a boost to our tourism-based economy. So then what do? We have to address the issues that make it difficult for people to remain safely housed, and that means giving them the ability to work or the financial resources to pay rent until they're able to work. We've got to crack the nut on childcare. Many people who want to work and were otherwise able to just can't do so if that means leaving young children at home or neglecting their children's education. A vast majority of our residents in family housing do work, and they work in retail, they work in food service, they're frontline medical personnel, and they can't do those jobs without that support. People who can't work need financial assistance, and that means rental assistance supports and supports for utility payments. Lastly, we do urge the municipality to be very cautious when considering moratoria on evictions as a longer-term solution. Our observation has been that in some circumstances, eviction moratoria have begun impacting some renter attitudes, and that's a concern, not because frankly, it's the thing that impacts the amount of revenue coming into an affordable housing property or not. What's concerning about that is that what we see in the operation of affordable housing is that typically when a low-income renter ends up falling behind by more than a month, it becomes almost impossible for them to climb out of that hole. So if individuals are under the mistaken impression that a moratorium on evictions is a free pass and that they don't have to climb out of that hole, they may end up getting themselves into pretty deep trouble. So we would just advise some caution there. And then finally, I'm going to hand off very briefly to Chris Kolarok, who is going to provide just a quick summary of what we anticipate that the municipality can kind of expect to experience on the development side for affordable housing in the months and years to come.
Thank you, Gabe. In terms of potential for the future, I think we have some headwinds for development. I think there will be an increased need for affordable housing. That's pretty clear in the increase we saw in April over the prior 3 months. I think in addition, reports from states that began reopening their economies earlier suggest that the economic recovery there is not V-shaped. So those economies are not recovering quickly. And what that potentially means is that people are not going to be regaining their employment and incomes as fast. And we're in an interesting time because of the supplemented unemployment benefits that will end in July, and then the extended unemployment benefits that are going to be ending at the end of the year, those two separate programs. So we are in sort of a holding pattern, but we see a potential for increase in need in the affordable housing sector. One of the issues that we have is that COVID-19 has disrupted the ability of affordable housing developers to complete projects already in pre-development. We are members of networks, national networks, several, and our peer organizations are reporting that several deals that were already along in process, agreed to in principle, and pricing are having difficulty actually getting to final inking. And that's because the low-income housing tax credit, which is one of the primary tools for affordable housing development, relies on large corporations that have a tax liability. They harvest the tax credits from their investment. And so as COVID-19 is depressing economic activity and wiping out projections for profits for corporations, their demand for credits is declining as well. So affordable housing, we know there's a current demand increase. We can see headwinds in the future, and that creates a third problem in that there are still people who are employed now in various professional positions or positions where their projects are funded with federal dollars or whatnot, who are still able to purchase housing or rent housing And so our worry is that there will be actually a two-peak housing graph, a large peak in the affordable demand and a decently high peak in what I would call maybe semi-luxury housing, with a wide gulf in between. And that creates a problem for our ability to move tenants who are able and ready and capable out of an affordable housing unit into a non-assisted housing unit. In an ideal world, when people are ready, they have a job, they have the income, they have the life skills and ability to move into a non-assisted apartment or a non-assisted housing unit. But if the demand is not there for construction, and we have a sort of a dipolar demand spikes with those two demand peaks, we can't keep that moving. And so I just wanted to highlight some of those headwinds and potential problems in affordable housing development supply. I think one of the ways, as I mentioned earlier, that we can try to head off some of this is in monitoring the low-income housing tax credit program in Congress, and some partnerships to advocate for that, for good credit floors and enhancements to that program for developing housing. That's all I wanted to discuss at the moment. If there are any questions, I appreciate your time, and that's all I've got for the minute.
Thank you so much. So we will do questions after the presenters for this section. But I did have one question actually to help us in this context, because there might be different definitions we're working off of. So what is the definition that you are working off of for affordable housing?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So there is no singular definition. We operate a multitude of programs that serve a variety of different income ranges. Generally, our primary target population for Cookingland Housing's affordable rental stock are those individuals between 30% and 80% of area median income. That includes extremely low-income households, but also some that many would categorize as being in workforce housing.
Great. Thank you. And I'll ask each of the presenters to define that as well, just in case we're all working off of different definitions. So next I'll move to the Daniel Delfino, the Director of Planning and Program Development at the Alaska Housing Finance Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Assembly members, for the opportunity to speak today. For the record, Daniel Delfino with the Alaska Housing Finance Corporation, and what we do in the planning department is we operate a number of programs that work in a couple of different spaces. The primary ones are programs that deal with supportive housing to prevent and deal with folks that are on the streets to prevent homelessness and get people rehoused. And then the second big thing is to focus on the expansion of actual sticks and bricks, new housing units, or rehabilitating or repurposing existing housing inventory for specialized populations. So Chairman, your question about affordable housing was how I was planning to start. When we're looking at the sort of landscape and the needs that we need to respond to as a corporation, is the way that I try and break it down, at least internally for my head, is that there are three different buckets that the groups fall into. There are the extremely poor folks who make $20,000 to $30,000 a year, who, regardless of a good economy, a bad economy, they're always going to need help. They're never going to have enough money at that income level, even in a healthy or a vacant housing market. They're going to need some assistance from rental assistance or some other enhancement, more so than just an affordable rent. And then we have the folks who work, say in retail, they may work 30, 40 hours a week, but they don't make enough to cover the fair market rent. But if we can make it so a developer doesn't have to borrow as much money to build an affordable or to build a property, if we can cut their loan size in half in exchange for them agreeing to charge less in rent, then we can make it so that that person can pay a reduced rent to an affordable housing development like the ones that Cookingland Housing operates, without some ongoing rental assistance from Alaska Housing. And then the third group are the people that are in sort of specialized housing. These can be folks with disabilities where they need a more adaptive living environment, or seniors and elders who need different types of building configurations and accessible space. And the reason why I distinguish those three is that the headwinds that each one of those populations face are different, and they don't all move in the same direction in terms of need. So with regards to what's happened recently, we track the market performance through an annual rental market survey every year that the Department of Labor does for us, where they send out a survey to unsubsidized units, so units without rent controls. This would be the Dean Wideners of the world, and they ask them how their properties are doing. It's done every year the week of March 11th, and we just got that survey result back. So for Anchorage, the vacancy rates have gone up a little, but the bottom didn't fall out through the market. So it went from, I believe, 5.2 last year up to 5.7, and we're in the process of finalizing that result. So it's not catastrophic. It's a little bit of an increase, but it's not a huge move. Again, that was before all the shutdowns happened, but at least back in the week of March 11th, we were doing okay. The thing is, the market has changed over the last decade, and that we went from having about 291,000 people in 2010 up to close to 300,000 the middle of the decade. And now we're back down to 290,000 people, or 291, whatever the number is. So our population has shed a little bit, and at the same time, vacancy rates have gone up. So we had, if we look back at 2010, the vacancy rates in the unsubsidized market were under 2%. Now they're up to 5.7. And 5.7 is not it would be nice if it was lower, but it's not a catastrophically bad vacancy rate. But what we've seen also in terms of the vacancy rates increasing, we've also seen the rents starting to decrease since 2015 and 2016. So they've ratcheted down incrementally. So the vacancy rates are going up, the rents are coming down, and what we're seeing is when we look at the different affordable housing cohorts that we serve through our programs, the fair market rents that folks can find in unsubsidized properties are getting closer and closer to the income limits. Like when we say rent is restricted for a household at 60% area median income, whatever that rent limit is, that's now higher than what the fair market rents are for a number of properties. So what we're trying to do with our housing programs is to make sure that we're not indirectly competing with the people who are already in the housing industry outside of affordable housing, and focusing on the need. Like right now, the working poor, there are fewer of them in response to the unemployment numbers. So when I talked about the three different categories, the people who are in the $20,000 to $30,000 a year range, there are more of them now as a result of some of the closures and the increased unemployment claims. So with regards to what we need or what we're looking at right now, we know that there are more people in that group that need help right now than the people who are priced out, who are still working, that can't find an affordable rental in the private sector. So that's just some of the things that we look at. Is we're trying to make sure that we're assessing the different subcomponents of the market to make sure that our housing is responsive to the sort of most pressing need that's emerging for us.
Great, thank you so much. Next, we will move to Rob Marks and Patrick Anderson with Rural Cap. Rob is the senior team lead on housing, and Patrick is the CEO. I'll turn it over to you two.
Thanks for that. I see a lot of people on here. Let me ask if Rob is also on. Okay, if I'm it, I'm it. We have a very different market than everyone else. We are in the highly needy portion with the ultimate almost zero resource market. And there are a lot of challenges that we see. We do have a couple of LIHTC properties that hold our feet to a very firm fire. And there is a lot of risk in those programs. There's a lot of upside and benefit towards the end. I'm not quite sure. I hear some chuckling in the background. Was that you, Rob?
No,
Okay.
no, but I got my computer to unmute, Patrick.
Oh, okay. Um, and so when I spoke to Felix, the area where I indicated that we occupy and the challenges that we will face going forward, that there is a lot of human effort that goes into our maintenance of our facilities. For example, right now I'm dealing with insurance questions, something that you ordinarily wouldn't think in terms of housing would be difficult, but with the challenging population that we deal with, we've had a number of fires. Those fires come from people who are not used to living in housing. When they turn on the stove, they get distracted. They might move on to some other task, and that leads to a fire in the facility. Each fire is pretty costly, even with a good fire detection system, and it's costly for public services as well when we have to call in the fire department. But insurance companies don't look kindly on high incident rates. So as a result, just assuring that we're compliant with our LIHTC partners and the program requirements, it kind of walks us into higher expenses. So right now we're going to be spending funds on putting automatic shutoffs on our stoves. Individuals who live in the outdoors, when they smoke, they don't need to go outside because they're already outside. When they're in our apartments, if they're intoxicated and smoking, have alcohol around, maybe spill some on themselves. We've had a couple of self-immolation type of incidents that have occurred. So our section of the market has 24/7 coverage. We have occasionally unsavory guests coming in who cause problems. And we also find that, and correct me if I'm misstating in any way, Rob, but if we go to distributed housing, it's bringing a particular type of tenant into a neighborhood that most neighborhoods don't tend to want. And so we're working through our biggest issues right now are that is that rural cap is subsidizing our housing to a very significant level, that there isn't a regular funding source. When the governor vetoed a number of budget items last summer, I went on record as saying that we were at risk of losing 2 of our properties. We just could not afford to subsidize any longer. So we're at risk of always losing some of the existing funding that we do have, which means that we cannot continue to sustain the level that we're at. So our major issue will be looking at whether local government or state government or federal government is interested in expanding the pool of funds. And even the pool of funds that has been expanded too, we have a couple of properties that are submarginal, require a lot of effort. So we spend a pretty considerable sum just on upgrading the water system to meet state and federal requirements. At Carluck Manor, we have water issues over at Sitka Place, and we just started a project or are starting a project to repair the roof at Sitka Place. It should extend the life of that facility 5 to 10 years. So we're not getting optimal properties. They're very expensive to maintain, and then the kind of tenant that we have requires pretty significant effort. We do have some low-income housing as well, but I don't see that as a major part of our market at this point. One area that the feds are moving into that we're interested in looking at is that not much progress has been made on alcohol addiction issues, but in the meantime, the opioid addiction crisis has it's been referred to since 1972 when Nixon first declared it a crisis. We're not finding solutions for that. And that's a significant portion of the population that we see needing to be served with non-traditional healing type processes. I'm seeing that money is entering into the tribal health systems and the tribal systems. There is some starting to show up in the state system. There were a couple of NOFAs coming out looking for new and innovative approaches. And then there's federal legislation that is also looking to heal the trauma portion of the population. And I feel very confident in saying that the population that we serve is heavily traumatized, and it shows in their behavior. So, Rob, feel free to add whatever you'd like to add at this point. I didn't have a script, so.
Sure. Thank you, Patrick, and thank you everyone for having me here today. Aside from what Patrick has said and what's been previously said, obviously we are watching a decrease in our rent collections during the pandemic. So I won't restate that anymore, but a few things that I'd bring forward that might not be obvious to someone looking from the outside. In supportive housing, there's been some massive changes during the last 10 weeks during the pandemic. 4 of our large properties are supportive housing based. And so that is a 24/7 operation for staffing. And I'm extremely pleased to say that we've successfully staffed our facilities through this entire time. But as the pandemic unfolded, there's been certainly folks who have gotten sick and called out and have required to be tested for the virus. And while thankfully none of our tenants or staff have tested positive for COVID-19, that the one unforeseen or not obvious outcome is that we've had increased staffing costs for overtime. We don't have a huge pool of staff that we can just plug in when someone's not available for a night shift. So we've had increased cost in staffing. We've also had increased cost to keep our facilities safe, including increasing our investment in cleaning and the cleaning services that we have in our facilities, as well as equipping all of our staff with as many cleaning and sanitizing products as we could. Thankfully, through the efforts of our development and our HR team, they were able to reach out on social media and obtain reusable masks for our tenants and staff, but we still require gloves and cleaning supplies, and these are large facilities. One thing that I would really add that I had not anticipated, but it does seem to be coming around as this month unfolds, is that with the hunker down, rural cap, by the nature of how we've operated, we tend to include all utilities in our rents. And what I've seen across the board is fairly skyrocketing use of water and electric over this time period, which again increases our costs greatly. With the hunker down, another byproduct that I have witnessed is we have had, nothing catastrophic, we have had increased incidents in our facilities. We have individuals who are in stressed households, and also already had a baseline mental health issue. And so we've had increased incidents, we've had some increased wear and tear on our facilities, as well as increased domestic issues in our households. We've had numerous households, especially at our Safe Harbor Muldoon location, that during this time, the family has splintered, and there are family members now no longer allowed in the household for domestic issues. So that is certainly catastrophic to the household, and it does impact our ability, or our tenants' ability to pay the fees and rents associated with living in our buildings. The only other thing that I would like to call attention to the group, and this is I've been trying to quantify this over the last day or two, and I'm not there yet. I don't have a solid number, but because we have so many supportive housing units, we have a large amount of tenants who traditionally have had the representative payees. And for those who may not know, in January and February, there has been a transition in the state of Alaska where the traditional system that has been in Alaska with the representative payee system, that it has been getting phased out. And what the general outcome was, the idea was the control of Social Security funds, they were going to be reverted back to the tenants. And there was a great bit of concern at Rural Cap, and I think throughout Anchorage and Alaska, what the outcome of that would be. But what I am tracking right now is,
And
I know
and Ramon, actually, sorry to interrupt really quick, but I need you to just wrap up your comments really quick. I want to save these last few minutes for questions from the members.
Certainly. So the outcome is that right now we have numerous tenants who are in a state of uncertainty of where their benefits actually rest. They haven't obtained their Social Security checks during the pandemic, and there's an inability to figure out where they stand during the hunker down. So that concludes my thoughts. Thank you all.
Great. Thank you both. I'm going to move on to questions. We have a few minutes left for questions, so I'll start with Ms. Zalata.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this is to any of the providers. I know there's been some work done previously by Cook Inlet Housing around risk pool for insurance. Right now, would expansion of the availability of either some kind of risk pool for insurance, would that help mitigate some of the effects of COVID-19? I know it doesn't take care of rent payment, but if anyone has any thoughts on that.
Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to address that. This is Gabe.
Go ahead.
So through the chair, thank you, Assembly Member Zalatel. So the work that Cook Inlet Housing has done on a pool has been around a landlord risk pool. And the idea there is to encourage private landlords to accept into their vacant housing individuals that otherwise might present such a risk of either non-payment or potential damage to the property, that landlord has those resources kind of secured on hand to help mitigate some of that risk and encourage them to make that housing available to that population. The short answer to your question is yes, an investment in a pool of that nature could very likely help to catalyze the transition of more individuals, particularly those who are currently experiencing homelessness or are at risk of homelessness, into units that are available and owned by private landlords. Widener apartment homes, you'll hear from some of their representatives later have some experience with that. But I will emphasize that it's just one of a number of tools that need to be made available. Another one that stands out that is worth consideration is what we call a landlord liaison. And the idea is that's an individual who's very skilled in conflict resolution, who helps to coordinate between renters who may not have a lot of rental experience or may have issues typically maintaining their housing, and help to be a line of communication with private sector landlords who do have some vacancy. There are a number of different tools that can be made available, and certainly a risk pool is one of them.
Great, thank you. I think we might have time for one more question if any of the members have an additional question. And if not, we will move on. All right, I'm not seeing any. Thank you all for your presentations and for sharing your thoughts. We're going to go ahead and move on to another discussion, changes in the real estate and housing construction markets. So we have approximately 30 minutes set aside for this. If we can go ahead, Barbara, cue up the first presentation from Joshua Nelson, who is a board member of the Board of Realtors. And then I'll turn it over to you, Josh.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the rest of the Assembly for taking time to invite us to join this conversation. Myself and my fellow board members are glad to be here. So as we'll see on the next slide, I believe, very good. So this is a weekly report starting in March 1st of this year, and it mirrors, of course, 2018 and 2019. You'll see that we were up 11% on new listings in the second week of March, and then as COVID hit, we bottomed out on the first or second week of April at 46% less than we did have last year. Historically, the end of April, May, and through June are our top months for new listing inventory. Moving on to pending transactions, which are pending transactions are transactions in which a buyer and a seller have come to terms on an agreement, but not have yet closed. And that closed will be covered in the third box you see there. We had a flat week, or we had a down week the first week, and then a 20% up over last year, the second week of March. And then as you see, as COVID hit, we did get down about 45% year over year. And then last week, we had a 7.83% increase in consumers writing on property over this time last year. Now you'll see the little asterisk for this week, 5/17 to 5/23 in pending transactions. As of noon today, 71 new transactions had pended this week. They have until midnight tonight to report those numbers. I would not expect those numbers to get up to 109, so I would expect this week to be somewhat less than last year as well. Moving on to closed transactions, which is the third box over to the right. We were having a fairly decent year in numbers and closed transactions starting out at the beginning of March. As you can see, all through March, we were up. And then we started to see a difference. And the reason for that is simply because COVID, we were able to go ahead and get a lot of the transactions that were in a pending status closed over the month of March, working with the mayor's office and the state. That would allow us to do that and safely close those. That was really great that we were able to do that. But then, of course, this month in May for closed units, we're seeing the 45-day delay of a pending transaction from April. We're seeing those numbers year over year are going down, and it was 31% less last week than this same week last year, and it is trending down again this week. So if we could move to the next slide. It's just another reference of this that shows a bar graph over the last 2 years. The same thing, it's just a different reference point here. It's been very interesting with the consumers. and consumer confidence out there. One of the things that we've noticed, and that's very, very interesting about this, is this year we've had quite an increase in an average sales price. As a matter of fact, in the month of April, for a single family home in the municipality of Anchorage, the average sales price was $403,000, which was up 12% year over year, and it was trending that way prior to COVID. We are a little too early to know and see what this is going to be on the long-term real estate market and consumer real estate market here in Anchorage. Over the next 45 days, we'll get a real clear picture of where we are going to bottom out and where we are heading. Of course, with oil and tourism doing market shifts, that's going to be very interesting as well. And then if we could look to the last slide there. This is the average sales price in which I was referencing earlier. You can see that the yellow graph shows, of course, the yellow bars is 2020. You can see we're slightly higher in January than last year. And then in February, we made a really decent jump, and also March, and then that held in April, surprisingly. And that has a direct correlation to less listings on market and buyers. So there was some thought that this would create a buyer's market, and what it's done is with the less inventory has kept the market competitive for those still in the market, although we can see that there are less total sellers and buyers than there were previous years. I do not have a crystal ball, nor am I an economist as to the future. There is concern. We will work towards it. We do believe that the PPP programs and the stimulus has helped from what we can tell. But really, I'd like to continue this conversation again with the Assembly, especially over the summer months, and it would be very good to visit this, as we will be visiting it internally through May and June and July, to see where we're kind of trajectory is going with consumer confidence in the housing market, specifically in Anchorage. I have no further comment at this time.
Great, thank you so much. Let's go ahead and queue up the next presentation. So we have Drew Kaysen, the Government Affairs Director with the Anchorage Home Builders Association.
Yeah, thank you. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, so my name is Drew Kaysen. I'm the Government Affairs Director with the Anchorage Home Builders Association. And I'm going to take a little bit of a different angle than I think folks have been so far. Our industry has experienced many of the same disruptions that have been referenced here. Certainly, there are anecdotal instances that we've had, members who were ready to ink deals that have since dried up. But on the whole, I think what we've seen from this year so far is that the home building industry is highly resilient to the COVID-19 virus. We have been able to continue to operate and do so while sort of obeying a variety of safety guidelines. And I think our members have done a good job about being proactive and creative in the ways that they engage with the virus. Now, that said, this sort of presentation I put together got started the last time one of our members spoke with you guys. Assemblyman Constant sort of asked about the permitting numbers relative to last year. And if you just look at last year, the numbers this year look pretty good. Unfortunately, just looking at last year is comparing to the single worst year for the building industry that we've got record for. It's actually worse than the late 80s. And I'll get into that in a minute. But you can see here on the first page that over the last 20 years, and this is all data from the state, they do the housing surveys. Anchorage has been falling well short of what we've been saying we need ourselves through various sort of public processes in the city. And that the last 20 years have shown a pretty, the first decade was looking pretty good. And then the second decade hasn't looked nearly as good. And in particular, the second half of the most recent decade has been a pretty rough time for the industry. So I've got some other sort of comparisons just from the sort of the federal numbers. that show how our municipal revenue, our employment, the municipal revenue is actually from the municipality. The employment and personal income are federal numbers, but we've been growing by a variety of measures, and our housing industry has certainly not kept up. If we go to the next slide. So you can see here, I found the Muni GIS data useful and was able to go back further than the state surveys do. And it shows that while the first decade of the last 20 years was certainly a lot better than the decade we're closing out now, it was nothing compared to the 70s and 80s. So you can see from this graph that we used to build, certainly we went through a couple of decades where we were building 5,000 or 10,000 housing units a year in Anchorage. At our absolute peak since 2000, we hit some of the lower end of those figures, but it was nothing like what we used to do. And that's okay. Anchorage's population wasn't growing at the same rate through then and all of that. But what gets really concerning is if you look at the most recent years, we're not on pace to replace our housing stock at anything like the rate that we need to. I imagine that many of you were living here in the 90s. That's about as early as I can remember driving around in Anchorage. But if you think about the fact that almost all of those homes are still, around, they weren't necessarily all amazing housing in the 90s. And we're going to be relying on those houses for another 100 years if we don't change something. And those houses are not ready to be relied on for the next 100 years. We're currently on pace to replace, about 4% per decade of our housing stock, and that's not realistic. So if you jump on to the next slide. One of the impacts of this has been that we're just directly losing taxpayers to the Matsu Borough. You can see there, the state has tracked it various times, sort of fairly direct in-migration and out-migration between the two. And so one study I found was from 2010 to 2016. So I haven't found anything that says that's not pretty representative of what's been happening since 2016. And as you can see, we get some people in, more than 1,000 people move into Anchorage every year from the Valley. Unfortunately, about 3,000 move back out. And so on net, we're still losing more than 1,000 people every year. And that's despite the fact that a bunch of those people are driving an hour each direction every single day. That is expensive and, is not time that they could be recreating or playing with their kids or doing anything else. There's some incentive to have a price premium for being in Anchorage, but it's been pretty clear that the costs are not are outweighed the costs of building in the Valley are so much cheaper that it's outweighing whatever other benefits Anchorage has for the preponderance of people making that choice. So we go on to the next slide. So in the last slide, I showed, that you've got 30% of the people in the Valley working in Anchorage, and yet the Valley continues to be the place that is where houses are getting built. That didn't always used to be the case. As recently as the early 2000s, Anchorage was still putting up more units of housing. But obviously, that has not been the case for several years, and it's getting further and further from the case. If you dive into these numbers and look at the year-over-year trends, the Valley has had a decade of slight increase for the most part, and Anchorage has had a decade of decrease. For some context, and I think this is mentioned in the previous slide, if we'd built just 5,000 additional units of housing over the last 10 years at well below what the sort of actual valuation of new houses is, we'd be adding, $20 million a year to our municipal revenues. And those are like, all of those figures are very realistic. We certainly could have built another 5,000 units in the last 10 years. It's easy that they would have been at 300 to 1,000 or more average valuation. It's quite possible that we could have, we're leaving substantially greater, we have already left substantially greater amounts of money on the table than that. And it's not really going anyplace right now. So we go on to the next slide. So I've talked a lot about sort of where the industry has been at over the last years, how we've been COVID resilient, but we haven't been resilient to the regulatory structures and sort of the incentives around cost drivers for constructing housing in Anchorage. And I think that you can see a fair amount of that borne out here in this last slide. So this is just the fourth quarter of 2019. I've requested from the state sort of the more longitudinal data, but it seems to be a pretty representative snapshot. And it shows that if you're buying a new home in Anchorage, it's a huge price premium over buying existing construction. That price premium is not borne out anywhere else in the state of Alaska. I haven't found any place else in the country that in order to have a new home, you have to pay 66% more than you would have to pay to buy an existing home. That doesn't do great things for people who might want to buy new homes. And so what we see as a result is that the only homes that get built are the luxury homes. And so I know Chris from Cook Inlet referenced earlier sort of the bimodal distribution of demand and possibly supply. And I think that there's a pretty clear causal story around if you are required to, in order to develop an infill lot, upgrade the water line from the existing 3/4 inch water line to a 1-inch water line, and that's going to cost you $30,000. That $30,000 is the same cost on a $300,000 home or a $600,000 home. But it's 10% increase in the cost of the $300,000 home and only a 5% increase for the $600,000 home. So what we've been seeing is that we can't afford to build affordable houses. We can only afford to build expensive houses because that's what pencils out. And that has a lot of problems on down the line. Yeah, so I think that that's pretty much what I wanted to say, and I'd be more than happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you so much for your presentation. At this point, those are the two presentations for this segment. Do Assembly members have any questions for either Joshua Nelson or Drew Kaysen?
Yes, Mr. Chair, this is Meg Zalatal. I'd asked to go in the queue.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see you. Go ahead.
Thank you. Looking at the numbers you presented, Mr. Nelson, I noticed that we are back up on your first slide there to higher number again of pending transactions. Can you talk to me about what, if any, effect there's been in the mortgage market or the availability of funds for people to pursue home purchases in light of COVID-19?
So that's an interesting point. Of course, interest rates have been around for a 30-year fix. They dropped at the beginning of this to about 3%. I've seen a lot of 3.125 and 3.25 for a 30-year fixed conventional mortgage, which has stimulated the mortgage market and actually has driven some buyers to go ahead and buy. So funds are still there. There have not been any hiccups. Actually, I still even have some first-time home buyers that are pursuing purchases and are using AHFC, which has been a blessing that those are still there. So I haven't seen a change in the mortgage market in the negative. It's actually all been positive in regards to consumers.
May I ask a follow-up, Mr. Chair?
Go ahead.
Thank you. Do you have any sense, going from first-time home buyers to those that were already in homes, if there's been any spike in foreclosures during the COVID-19 emergency?
Well, I don't have that number. That's kind of out of my wheelhouse, being in the banking world. But I understand with the forbearance, a lot of people who were having issues with making their mortgage payment have moved into forbearance, and the banks have been working with consumers that currently own their homes and have fallen on hard times to mitigate a foreclosure. Once again, we're going to see a lot of the kind of the hindsight of that in June, July, whenever these forbearance, people have to start paying back forbearance and whatnot. So as over the year, that'll be a big federal, there'll be some federal, I don't know if there will be federal assistance there, but I would imagine that will be a big federal question that will come up nationally.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, I'm not seeing any. I want to thank both Joshua and Drew for presenting today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So next, we're going to go into dialogue and discussion with a variety of partners on landlord and tenant issues. And then after that, talk about the rental assistance fund, and that'll end the discussion today. So we have about an hour for those two discussions. So first we have Nicole Nelson, the Executive Director of the Alaska Legal Services Corporation.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Nicole Nelson, and I'm the Executive Director of Alaska Legal Services. And for those of you who don't know about us, we're a nonprofit law firm that has been providing free legal assistance to those who can't afford it for over 50 years. And we're a statewide program, but also have offices in Anchorage. And one of the areas that we have focused on consistently over the past 50 years is providing legal help to low-income tenants. So prior to COVID, there was an enormous justice gap within the state, and it was consistent with the civil justice gap nationally, which meant that we were turning away about one person for everyone that we were able to accept on issues that were really relevant to people's families, domestic violence, preventing evictions, losing housing, and also helping people access the benefits that they need to sustain themselves. So two things have happened as a result of this crisis that have presented additional challenges for the community that we serve. First, there's been the number of people who qualify for our services has increased dramatically. Our estimates are that the number of people who now qualify for our services has increased by 2 or 3 times that amount. And again, we were already not able to serve fully those who needed our services to begin with. Additionally, compounding the lack of access to legal services is the addition that the laws have changed really rapidly, as I'm sure all of you are aware, over the last 3 months. So there have been changes to federal law, to state law, and on local laws. And additionally, the court system, because of COVID, is operating in a limited capacity. And so because of all of those competing laws and limitations on functionality within various institutions, there has become a crisis within the community of just having good access to solid legal information so that people can make good decisions in their lives. And so the laws are changing very rapidly, and neither landlords or tenants really have a clear picture across the board of what their rights and responsibilities are on either side. And so this has created, we have had unprecedented traffic to our hotline, although Alaska Legal Services, our doors right now are closed to the public. We have been serving people remotely, and approximately at least 30% of the clients we serve in any given year are in high-risk categories for COVID. So it's very important that that our offices not become a site for transmission of COVID, in addition to keeping our staff and the rest of the community safe. But we have been operational through our intake hotline, and also pro bono hotlines running in the evenings on landlord-tenant issues. And again, we've had unprecedented traffic to our helplines. Additionally, we operate a website called Alaska Law Help that seeks to provide good information to the community about what their rights and responsibilities are on a wide variety of topics. We've also been doing Facebook Live webinars, trying to get information out to the public so that they can make good decisions about their lives. And the two areas where we are getting the most questions, and there's a great deal of confusion, the number one is with respect to housing, and the second one is on unemployment insurance. And so I think this probably is surprising to no one. The laws have changed very rapidly in those 3 areas. And again, the need is dramatic in those areas. So the court systems, just by way of background a little bit, just to give a little bit more background on the legal state of play currently, the court system is operating with limited functionality, especially in the civil realm. And so they're taking only emergency cases at this point and not hearing most FEDs. And FEDs are eviction hearings. We anticipate that the court system will start hearing cases again on the civil side of things, but again, there will have been a very long backlog because they have not been able to hold those hearings for the last several months. And once they become operational, there will be quite a queue coming forward. In addition to limited operations at the court system, the state legislature passed SB 241 before it left session a few months ago. And with SB 241, there was a moratorium on evicting people for non-payment of rent through June 30th. Again, getting that information out to both landlords and tenants so they understand that has been a challenge. Additionally, on the federal side, federal law was passed that protects tenants from being evicted for non-payment of rent in certain subsidized properties, and that goes through July 25th. And so there are 3 different competing and overlaying deadlines based on sort of state court operations, state court law, and then also federal law. And all of those intersect and are all very confusing. So there's a great need for additional information for people to understand what's happening in the community. It's also very challenging for a number of people. We are seeing folks coming into the system who have not previously relied on needs-based assistance. So these programs are all new to them as well. One of our big concerns, other than just making sure that people have good legal information and are making good decisions based on that, is also the eviction moratoriums that have been in place for non-payment of rent that are set to expire over the course of this summer. They did not, as Gabe Lehman said earlier, they didn't forgive the rent. They've just sort of delayed payment on those. And so they're going to be, tenants, low-income tenants are going to be faced with balloon payments at the end of the summer whenever those moratoriums expire. And of course, if they weren't able to make rent when they first came into place, they are nothing has really changed over the course of the last 3 months that would lead us to believe that they're going to be in a better position to make rent payments and increase those the back payment to fulfill that. And so we think that there's a big need for the municipality. If there was something the assembly could do, would be to expand or have a very aggressive rent relief, some type of rent relief program, and to make sure that it was that program was able to reach people and the people had widespread information about how to access it. And the reason that would be beneficial both to landlords and tenants, I think that no one wins when if all of the tenants end up being evicted at the end of the moratorium and end up on the streets and homeless. That's not going to help our landlord community either get the revenues that they need. So that's something that's been of concern for us too. And we'd also like to avoid seeing, again, these are a lot of the folks we're seeing now have not relied on needs-based assistance before and maybe have never missed rent in the past. And if they, because of circumstances related to the pandemic, are now faced with not being able to make rent for the first time in their rent history, we would hate to see them get an FED on their record. So that's only going to prevent them from being able to get housing in the future. And so if there are a way that we could make sure that people who needed assistance are connected to a program right away and avoid having an FED filed, I think it would serve the community well. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Next, we have Michael Patterson, the chair of the Anchorage Tenants Union. And Michael, I'm not sure if you are on a phone, but if you are on a phone, You can press *6 to unmute yourself.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Hi. My name's Michael. Thank you for having me on today, Mr. Chair and the Assembly. My name is Michael Patterson. I'm the chair of the Anchorage Tenants Union. We are obviously a local Anchorage-based organization that works to kind of collectivize tenant struggles and help them advocate for themselves and work with landlords to negotiate and solve problems before they become a huge issue. And so today I'm not really going to be talking about like the housing market and stuff like that. What I'm really going to be focused on is sort of like the anxieties that the tenants have been coming, that the tenants who have been coming to us have expressed, and the organizers within our the tenants union, because we're all pretty much either working poor or working class community organizers. And so I've kind of broken it down into two main points. And the first would be like sort of the short-term anxieties that tenants are facing. And the first one being is the evictions. And like what was just spoken about in terms of the moratoriums and ending is that there is a lot of misinformation, and it's hard to get information in terms of what the state has done and what the federal government has done in terms of evictions or the moratorium on evictions. And then also another kind of area of concern is like there seems to be a sort of inconsistency with the timelines of when the moratoriums end, and then with the state about to set up a sort of like homeless abatement housing relief program and the munis housing relief program that was set up a while ago, that really that the moratoriums are going to end before these programs can kind of like really get off the ground and sort of like catch up to like what the need actually is for those folks who have accumulated a lot of debts due to rent and like even like utility bills as well. And then the other thing with the moratorium is that it only really covered the state one only really covered folks who were affected by COVID-19. It did not cover other workers or tenants. And so a lot of tenants, even prior to COVID-19, were already pretty rent burdened. And so like if you're an essential worker, you know, you're barely making ends meet. And then now say like you're a grocery worker, you're not really seeing an increase in your pay. And then, you know, you're not getting the additional 600 unemployment. You know, the moratorium doesn't apply to you. So you're still obligated to pay that rent. And so you're still breaking even. That doesn't really give those sort of tenants and those workers any sort of like relief in terms of like, you know, if there's a subsequent wave or if they get sick or just any incidentals of life, you know, kiddo needs new glasses, flat tire, that still kind of leaves them in a very vulnerable position. And that's something, you know, and I know it said earlier with the moratorium and that a lot of folks think that they're kind of off the hook when it comes to paying back that debt, that rent debt. But I don't know if it's something that the municipality could either think about or maybe talk to the state about, really looking at that moratorium eviction and potentially extending it, and at the same time kind of implementing a program that really sort of like makes that information a lot more readily available, but also that extension of the moratorium would cover, you know, hopefully all tenants. Sorry. And then, you know, and so I know there's some sort of apprehension with, you know, if you cover all tenants, that landlords are going to miss out or they're kind of going to be left holding the bag. But really, I think there's an opportunity with the municipality and the state to work with landlords to kind of be more proactive and say, okay, what is the need going to be in the future in terms of like missed revenue or missed profit? And then kind of being like, let's operate, you know, 2 or 3 months ahead in advance so we don't have these folks who have not traditionally used subsidized services, and so that we're not overloading the system kind of downstream as well. And then the kind of second issue that's come up with folks who have like reached out to us is leases. You know, a lot of tenants have told us that landlords are working with them and they are deferring payments, but then there's also this like sort of like conditions to that deferment of payment, where they'll say, well, we'll defer your payments, but you have to sign a 12-month lease. And then those deferred payments will come later, which essentially is just a rent increase. And a lot of the anxiety with tenants is that I don't know what the economy is going to look like 12 months down the road. So I don't really know, if I can actually do that, but I don't want to end up on the street, and I don't want to wait to get help. So, I'm just going to go ahead and do it, not really knowing or being able to plan well into the future of what their financial situation is going to be, because, there's a lot of uncertainty going around with how the economy is going to the economic effect is going to outlive COVID-19. And then we've also had some folks come to us and say that some landlords are trying to offload the utilities onto them in their new leases. I haven't heard it as much, but that's in our opinion, that's more or less it's another rent increase. And what we really don't want to see for working poor and working class folks who are not at the level of asking for subsidized assistance yet is that essentially that they're just getting indirect rent increases when at a time they're not really sure of their economic situation, a month from now or a year from now. And so that's just something that I really would like the municipality to look at and see if there's some way that they can work that out. And then, overall, kind of with these leases and kind of with the short-term sort of anxiety with tenants, is that it's really hard to make long-term financial and housing decisions if you're only focused on, tomorrow or just getting through the day, or I don't know what 3 months is going to look like. So why, 6 months or 12 months from now, there's no way I can really plan for that. And I think the municipality has an opportunity, and especially with this housing relief program, to really sort of alleviate a lot of that stress and anxiety for tenants and landlords, because there is a mutual interest there in terms of leveling the playing field and making everyone a little less stressed out. And then sort of the third point that I wanted to bring up was unemployment, which I think is a huge key to this. And I was on the last call for the Business Roundtable, and I would just kind of wanted to say that with unemployment, took so long to get unemployment. For myself personally, it took about 2 months. And so me and my family, we did have savings. We had basically 2.5 to almost 3 months of savings. And because it took so long to get it, that it wiped out our savings. And so basically, we were a week or a month away from not being able to pay our rent. And then luckily, the unemployment started kicking in, and now we're in a much better position. But then on top of that, there's this sort of, there's this second gut punch that's going to come in terms of when that $600 is kind of cut from unemployment. My unemployment payments are going to drop from $784 a week to $184 a week. And that's just not sustainable with, 3 kids and a rent that costs $1,400. So, and I don't have a lot of faith that Congress is going to somehow address the solution in a timely manner to actually give people hope when they really need it now. And then, and then there's the ultimate, a lot of tenants just don't feel safe returning to work. The governor's remarks about reopening the state, and that, we kind of just shut down the state to build our hospital capacity, really just means that, to a working class person, is that we have room for you in the hospital now. And that's not very reassuring or inspiring. And so it's really kind of putting tenants and low income workers and working class workers in this very weird spot of I have to work, but deep down, I don't really feel safe. If we have a subsequent wave or something like that, it just doesn't really, the anxiety is kind of through the roof. And then kind of what was talked about before me was the sort of legal assistance, is that if the programs and the moratoriums aren't going to be on sort of the same timeline of when they end, that means a lot of people are going to probably slip through the cracks in terms of getting help. And there's a big concern that those tenants are just not going to get the legal assistance that they need. And from our perspective as an organization, we think all these tenants need to have legal representation when going through an eviction process. That was the consequence of COVID-19. And I don't know what the municipality can do about that, but in terms, I think it's something definitely to look into and investigate of how sort of like what Alaska Legal Services does, if there's any way the municipality can augment that or supplement that or come up with something complementary to really make sure that those folks are not going to court alone and that they do have legal assistance when they're going in front of a judge.
Great.
And then,
thank you so much, Michael. I'm sorry, I think I'm gonna have to cut you off. But if you have a short closing, go ahead. But I am gonna have to cut you off.
Sure. So I would just basically say the long-term effects that tenants are concerned about is stable housing. We don't want to see rent increases not in terms of like how the market is operating, but more like indirect. So where landlords are increasing security deposits to really like secure their investment. And then there's also things outside of the wheelhouse of housing that if we want to address these issues, like raising minimum wage, making sure low income and working class people have benefits, I think that's also going to help this housing situation, especially for low income and working class tenants. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that, Michael. Next, and folks, feel free to get into the queue. We have, I think, 2 more presenters, and then we'll take questions. So next we have Widener Apartments. We have 2 presenters from their end. We have Ryan Schmidinger, the Regional Director, and Greg Serbana, the Vice President of Public Relations. I'll turn it over to you 2.
Thanks so much for having us today. I've enjoyed the comments thus far. To introduce myself, my name is Ryan Schmidinger. I work here locally for Widener Apartment Homes to support their Alaskan region. I'd like to first start with just a little bit of background, and that ties into Widener's experience in housing with the COVID situation. We represent market rate housing. We have about 5,200 apartment units total in the state of Alaska, and that's comprised of about 44 different apartment communities. I don't have a solid number in front of me for how many residents that makes up, but my intelligent guess is anywhere from 12 to 15,000 people lovingly call us home, hopefully. So we feel a big responsibility to participate in supporting Alaskans, and we've come up with some things that have been working to try not only to alleviate the circumstances for our residents, but to Nicole's point and Michael's point, try to support that when evictions do become active again, that we help support not having these residents cross over into a dire need of subsidized services and almost exacerbate the current problem. So the first thing that we're offering our residents is a rent payment program. There is some criteria to it, but the short version is we can offer what you owe if you don't have the rent money. We can split that up over a 12-month period. Sometimes it's not a full rent amount that's owed. Sometimes it's half the rent. Sometimes it's 3/4. But these rent payments have been crucial for us to keep our residents housed and secure. Currently, just some data on this, we've got about 298 balances owed as a company. As a region, so just in the Alaska region. 186 of those balances that really make up apartment units are on a payment plan, and they are performing to that payment plan. So whether that's $80 a month or $300 a month, just depending on what the resident needed, we're happy to be able to report there's only about 37% that don't want to be on a payment plan or are kind of just seeing how this whole thing plays out. when evictions become active again. That leaves about 112 households that haven't utilized this payment plan, and that's really where I urge the municipality and kind of parrot Nicole's comments and Michael's comments that we really need to make sure that 112 households, at least for Widener's experience, has the correct services to stay secure and stay housed when evictions do become active again. We've offered that payment plan, but for whatever reason, they're not interested. And those 112 households are still going to need to be housed. We're also waiving all lease termination fees or rent responsibility if you come to us and say, I've been affected by COVID and I need to leave, and I'm in a current lease term. So we're trying to grease the gears for you to terminate your lease. If that means you're moving back in with mom and dad, or you're moving in with your sister, or you're moving out of state, whatever the reason is, we're really trying to make it a no barrier for you to go achieve your sense of security or safety again. We've halted all rent increases. So if you are organically up for a lease renewal right now, you're being sent a lease renewal proposal that is not reflective of increases. And we're also waiving any late fees for rent. So those are the things that we feel we can kind of contribute to our state and our fellow Alaskans to try to support seeing us through this time. The problems it's creating for Widener is very similar to other landlords. There is a big delinquency problem right now with unpaid rents, and obviously for a lot of landlords that means threatening their ability to pay their mortgage. Keeping our residents and our associates safe is of paramount importance and of paramount cost. From new protocols on site that include heightened cleaning to the tune of 3 or 4 times a day, touch points, common areas, elevators, you name it. Our workplace is comprised of high density populations. So we have apartment communities where 800 people could be using the same building doors and elevators in any given day. So we take that pretty seriously, and providing the correct personal protective equipment, providing the correct cleaning materials has been our main focus, because obviously we want to keep our communities sanitized, which means our residents and associates are safe, but we also want to keep our associates at work. We're proud to say we haven't had to do any layoffs, and part of surviving this obstacle, both locally and nationally, is keeping people working. We're only doing emergency work orders at this time, so leaks, no heat, your refrigerator doesn't work, things of that nature, just to lessen the in-person contact or potential exposure between staff members and residents. That's been working okay, but we're anxious to get to a place where we can return to giving our residents full services that they pay for when they're with us. And that also includes some of our amenities have been closed. That would include fitness centers or social areas if we have them on property. We just felt it best to not open up that potential can of worms as we monitored how the state's numbers were doing as it relates to confirmed cases. Overall, that really sums up my comments. I do have my Vice President of Public Relations, Greg Cerbana, on the line with us, and would like to give him a chance to provide his comments.
Thanks, Ryan, and thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be brief if I can, and I'll add just a little bit of flavor to what Ryan has shared for the benefit of the Assembly members. Ryan talked a little bit about some of our experiences there in Alaska, and in particular as it relates to collections of rents, which is one of the primary issues that I think many landlords are looking at, and whether they're small landlords that own 1 to 5 buildings or larger ones like us, because mortgages really are one of those challenges that have to be paid, and generally are the primary way that those are paid are through rent collection. So the National Multi-Housing Council, as of the 13th of this month, issued a rent payment tracker and found that 87.7% of apartment households made a full or partial rent payment May 13th. And that was a survey of over 11 million units of professionally managed apartment units throughout the country. That's a 2.1% decrease in the share who paid rent through May 13th from the month prior. To be quite frank with you, I'm surprised at those numbers. I would have thought that it was worse, and it was going to be worse. But as alluded to earlier today by other speakers, potentially I think some of the reasons are the stimulus money that has come through from the feds, the increased unemployment that has happened, and that many folks have had savings that they've had to dip into. So we are cautious about this as to whether or not that's going to continue on beyond June or July. We can imagine that continuing on in June. July may be more challenging as the additional monies through unemployment run out. So that's interesting. I mean, our experience has been about 5 points higher than that. Widener has than the national average, but still that is a challenge for many of us. There's a document that's put out by the National Apartment Association that talks about $1 of rent. It's an infographic that I can send to you, Mr. Chair, if you'd like, but it talks about rental housing owners and what those dollars go through. And I think there's maybe a misconception that rental housing owners enjoy very large margins and can continue to operate in the absence of rent payments if that happens for a long time. So here's something that you might be interested in that we didn't know, that only 9% of every dollar, or 9 cents, are returned to owners, including many apartment owners who are themselves small business and rely on that revenue to make their mortgage payments. 39 cents or 39% goes to mortgage and insurance, and 10% goes to capital expenditures, including roofs and HVAC and those sorts of repairs that are needed. 27 cents of every dollar cover payroll expenses, and then 14 cents goes to property taxes. Those are averages, but I think they help underscore some of the challenges that we have if there's an extended period of time where rents are not collected by a goodly portion of residents. That hasn't been what we've experienced either in Alaska or in our company or throughout the United States, but it is a problem. And for color's sake, if I can, I think as of right now, our company is, I'm looking this up real quick, it's 96.63% collected, which is, if all dollars could be collected in rent where people are under contract, we've collected 96.63%. At this time of the month, generally, we would be over 99%, so under 1%, and then by the end of the month, typically we have a delinquency of under 0.5%. So that gives you an idea of what that kind of looks like. I'll mention just two more things if I could, is that as of late last week, the House of Representatives passed the HEROES Act, which is the Health and Economic Recovery Omnibus Emergency Solutions. And essentially that established $100 billion emergency rental assistance program. And per the bill, the funds would be dispersed to both state and local government grantees and delivered in consultation with a continuum of care providers through HUD's Emergency Solutions Grant Program. While we have some challenges, and we being folks that sit at the board level of the National Apartment Association have some challenges in the way this bill is written, we applaud the House for talking about direct subsidy to the renters and the people who need it the most, and who are in direct challenge of losing their homes if they can't get some relief before this epidemic and this pandemic ends, and before they can get back to work. So we're going to work hard as an industry to support those efforts to get money into the hands of those that need it so they can stay housed. And if the chair will indulge me for one more minute, I'd like to add to what Gabe Lehman had spoke about earlier. Is that okay?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so we participated with Cook Inlet Housing, many of you know, in the Path to Independence program, which seeks to bring landlords, private sector landlords, connected more closely with social service providers and those that are working in the homeless housing field. And I must underscore to this body that part of the reason it's been so difficult to make that transition happen is that market rate providers have been really hesitant to participate in a wider way to house that specialized population. And I think we need a couple of things, and what P2I tried to do is to address five specific issues. One, private market providers of housing, landlords, they need some assurance, they need some assistance, frankly, with wraparound social service intervention and ongoing case management. Why? Because they don't do that work. They're not very good at it, and that's not what their expertise is. And I don't think we should be asking them to know how to do that. But the critical component of matching those two skill sets, you know, folks who work in provide housing and those who work to try and get the homeless or those who have recently lost their homes back into shelter, out of shelter and into permanent supportive housing is very important. The landlord liaison function that Gabe talked about was great. It's a one-stop place where landlords who are not very familiar with the different offerings and the assistance that's out there can get to a landlord liaison and be able to access those services. And hopefully the municipality will start to see that navigation role, that landlord liaison role is important, can be expanded, and then we can have many more people offering their buildings up to serve this population. The landlord risk pool that he talked about help to mitigate risk, and so we share that amongst more than just, you know, the landlord who's offering up their buildings. And then most important, there's an employment navigation part that's very, very important. As people can get a job or get a better job, they can be able to afford and stay into that housing for the long term. So those are my comments. Appreciate the opportunity to give them, and we'll answer any questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you both. All right, so we're going to turn to our last presenter in this section, and then we'll go to questions. We are running just a little bit behind, but hopefully that's okay with folks. So I will turn to Cassandra Taggart, the president of the Landlord's Almanac.
Good day, Chair. Thank you for letting me speak today. I appreciate it. So first, just to let everyone know, I'm Cassandra with Real Property Management, and I also run a club called the Landlord's Almanac, which is around 2,500 do-it-yourself type landlords. So I'm more speaking from that perspective today, just to help the audience understand that of the rental market, majority of them is the do-it-yourself landlords. And if you do the math, it's somewhere approximately between 70% and 80% of the rentals that are out there is from that market. I do also want to say that I appreciate the Alaska Legal's work in helping these landlords and tenants, because the navigation between the muni, state, and the federal level regulations has been very difficult to navigate, and we've been supporting Alaska Legal and trying to get the information out to the do-it-yourself landlords so everybody can make a better financial decision between the groups. So what I'd like to say is some statistics of local numbers of what's been going on based on surveys with that database. It's not a huge database, but it is something that'll indicate some numbers for you. I'm in a nationwide franchise where we have over 350 offices. That group manages over 14,000 homeowners. Based on different states, it ranges from 2% to 37% of people not paying rent. It gets to the higher percent when it gets closer to high tourist areas, such as Alaska, Florida, so forth. Here locally, based on the surveys of the do-it-yourself landlords, I'm getting about 68% say tenants have paid. Then I've got about 20% to 25% saying they have not paid. Majority of it is less than 2,000, and there are several landlords sitting in the 5,000 hasn't been collected category. Next, I want to comment on the foreclosure statistic, just to kind of let you guys know a history on that one. In 2007, when the banks had the last crisis, they started adding clauses to mortgages that basically says the bank can do a forced takeover and not actually foreclose on the property, but do a forced takeover and make it a rental property until proceeds come through, and then they phase it into the foreclosure process. So for example, if we have 130 foreclosures sitting on market, there's actually another backlog sitting there that you won't be able to see because they're called pre-foreclosures and they are sitting as rentals. Our company actually manages quite a few of those. And just to kind of share some notes, there is one bank that has 100 of them right now. So just know the banks already have an action plan to try to phase those and protect the housing market from crashing again, but they will have a backlog and they already have a plan of attack to try to phase with them and work with them. Next, I just want to do a reminder of what most landlords have been facing over the last 2 years, because many have forgotten what it's like to be a small landlord. Reserves are already down for those guys. Taxes have increased, utilities have increased, insurance has increased. Cost of trades, like for example, a plumber, just 2017, it was like $90 to have a plumber. Now we're talking $130, $150 all day long just for an hour of plumbing work. Codes and permitting has increased, and they have been going around doing audits, going after landlords, which has really caused a lot of problems. We've also got the repairs from the earthquake. Those are still happening. They're not all fixed. So each category is increased between 10 and 30%. So with that being said, most of the do-it-yourself landlords are sitting at zero profits, and most of them actually are sitting at negative cash flow, and they're only holding on because it's their only rental. Then also, just letting you guys know, rents did go down starting in 2015, 2016. Most of the do-it-yourself landlords didn't recognize it or realize it until about 2017, and they are actively dropping rent prices between 2017, 2019, and even today they're dropping rent prices. They are not doing rent increases. Most of them are just happy to have tenants who are paying. Majority of the landlords are doing payment plans. Majority of the landlords said they don't want to evict anyone if the tenant is trying to pay. Majority have already waived or held off on doing late fees and even filing for evictions, even when they could file for eviction or file for late fees or include late fees. Even if they could, they're not doing it. Landlords are very upset over squatters because we cannot evict for those. We have several that have had squatters from February and March, and they're still sitting there squatting and can't do anything about them. And 2 of them finally got their court case, and their court case isn't even until the last week of June right now. That's if it doesn't backlog and we can serve. So those guys are sitting at 3-4 months with no assistance. Next, what I do want to say, response that most of the do-yourself landlords are doing right now is that they decided that they're more scared of what they call tenant hoppers, where they crew up a balance with, let's say, like a company like Weiner, and then they'll just skip before the eviction. And all that time they saved up their cash and they're using it to do their down payment to move to the next place. Well, that makes it to where you don't know they're hopping because they're not going to be evicted yet, but they're using that money to hop to the next place to apply. So what the do-it-yourself landlords are doing, or talking of doing, I should say, is some of them are choosing to just stay vacant. They don't want the headaches of it, and they don't want to have to screen around it because there's so many rules around screening. They don't want to break rules around screening. Some of them are increasing the cost for tenants to even enter the unit. Many conversations around higher security deposits and guaranteeing full 30 days of rent before they even move in. And many are increasing the screening requirements, whereas before, for example, if you were late on medical bills, they might look the other way on that, whereas now they're using that as a way to say, sorry, decline. They want a perfect tenant, or they'd rather sit vacant. The last bit I have is private landlords are having a difficult time connecting to housing providers. I completely agree with what Greg said. Case management and security of the funds is a big issue. And outreach to the do-it-yourself landlords about the available housing programs that they can use to fix vacancies is very difficult. And many of them still will not consider, even once they've attended classes and education from the Alaska Housing Office and from our community club that we have. They just have misunderstandings and don't have enough security to help housing providers, so they just won't participate. And let's see, that is all I have for Chair. I am available for any questions if you need any.
Great, thank you so much. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to questions. I think we can take a few questions before we move on to the last presentation on the Rental Assistance Fund. I'll start with Ms. Zolotow.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is, do we have any sense of how much deferred rent is outstanding in the municipality right now, where individuals completed the sworn statement and have either deferred or only made partial payment of rent? Do we have any idea of the outstanding balance?
And are you asking the administration if they have that number?
I'm asking any of the presenters, like if they happen to know their own, or if we have a sense of it. My guess is it's probably not aggregated information somewhere, but just trying to grab a ballpark to put it into some perspective.
Thanks.
I can provide comment for Widener if you'd like.
Go ahead.
So as of today, total dollar delinquency, is that what your question is geared towards?
Yes, as related to COVID, after we put in that you needed to just verify that your rent delinquency or forbearance was related to COVID.
I would say 90% of this figure applies to that, but roughly we're at about 211,000.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
I can also comment just to show the do-it-yourself landlord side.
Go ahead.
My numbers actually very in line with Ryan's numbers. I'm sitting at approximately $2,000 is what each of the do-it-yourself landlords say that they're accumulating in non-payment or slow pay. And then my portfolio, quite a bit smaller than Widener's, but I'm sitting at 10% unpaid. None of them have provided a COVID form, but I can say without a doubt that it is COVID related.
Mr. Chair, this is Gabe Lehman with Cook Inlet Housing. I'd be able to weigh in for Cook Inlet Housing on the affordable side as well.
Sure, go ahead.
So through the chair, thank you very much. Good question, Assembly Member Zolotow. I would tell you that at Cook Inlet Housing, in order to get an accurate picture, we've got to break the figure into two categories. We look at it for our senior housing developments and our family housing developments. Our senior housing developments are doing very well. May gross tenant rents that were due were about $186,500. And rent owed as of mid-May is only $2,700. So we are doing extremely well on that part of our portfolio. Where we're seeing issues is in family housing. Our May gross rents payable by tenants were about $624,000. We were able to collect $464,000 of that and still have $160,000 roughly outstanding. Basically what that means is that about 74% of the total tenant rents were collected. It's actually a fairly substantial increase from last month, which we attribute to stimulus hitting the bank accounts of many of our residents.
Thank you all. That's very helpful.
Great. Thanks, everyone. All right, I'm not hearing anyone else chime in on that one. Mr. Weddleton.
Well, I was trying to get to that same number and I guess it ties in with our last segment here is, what kind of dollar amount are we looking at? I mean, just in those two things with Widener and Cook Inlet Housing, you're at about 400,000, and I don't know what percents they have of the market, but I imagine it's multiples of that would be needed. So I'm sure the people who are presenting next have that number for us. That's
if I can chime in real quick, this is Greg Sorbana. I would remind those on the call that the experiences that we are seeing right now are, it's something that we wouldn't have imagined. We would have thought had been worse right off the bat. And so we're pleasantly surprised, as is the rest of the the respondents to the NAA and the NMHC polls. But we can't underscore how different we think this might be when federal stimulus, further federal stimulus dollars for rentals go away, or unemployment, the additional funding ceases in July.
Thank you. Good point. All right, hearing nothing else, any other questions before I turn it over to the last presenters? All right, not seeing anything. Go ahead and turn it over to Chris Schutte and Jason Buckenstad to present on the Rental Assistance Fund.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to attempt to try to share my screen. Does everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I might disappoint Mr. Weddleton. I don't know the exact numbers, but what I will say, and maybe just add on to what some of the previous folks have said about total number, is I think they are exactly right. I think with the fact that unemployment benefits have come in, and the fact that a $1,200 stimulus check went out from the federal government has probably helped prevent some of the issues that I think a lot of them were expecting as a result of this. But as I think all of them have recognized, after July, the increased unemployment benefits are going to go away, and we could start seeing some additional issues on that. So I'm going to try to race through this presentation relatively quickly. But, as you can see, and we've talked about today, unemployment rate is by July could be almost 18%. Just from March to April, almost over 70,000 Alaskans claimed unemployment benefits. And as you'll see in our next slide, that number has actually gone up significantly since then. And then just a couple of, statistics about, how many families and adults live paycheck to paycheck, and how much they spend on their household income every month. So as I, as you can see, the number of unemployment claims has gone up an additional 25,000 almost since the end of April. So just in the last 9 weeks, there's been almost 95,000 jobless claims. So a significant number, as you can see. 211 has seen an almost 300% increase in their calls seeking help, and that's looking back to March, April of last year to this year. And as you can see, last March and April, they received about 3,500 phone calls. This year it was 13,500. And the top unmet need that those callers were asking about was rental assistance, and they just didn't have any additional resources available to meet that need. They have, through donations and others, been able to help a little bit. They have provided about a little over $300,000 in assistance so far over the last 8 weeks. And as you can see, 95% of that has gone towards rental assistance and about 5% to utility assistance. So that brings us to our program, and it's, we pledged $1 million towards rental and mortgage assistance. And the way that we are looking at it is it's financial assistance going back to April, May, and then also June or July. It's available to all, or it will be available to all residents of the municipality of Anchorage. And then the applicants, they must have become unemployed due to layoffs or furloughs, or suffered a loss of income due to COVID-19. And then once they are selected for award, they will need to submit some backup documentation as required in the criteria above. But we're hoping to keep that relatively simple, and flexible for folks to be able to provide that. And then I think, as we've talked about, no money will actually go to the renter or borrower. We will work with them to provide the payment directly to their landlord or mortgage company. And what we have settled on is there's a maximum of financial assistance of $1,000 per month per household for a maximum of 2 months, or $2,000. And then any rent arrearages prior to April to 2020 will not be funded. And we made that decision essentially looking at when a lot of the hunker down and other orders started going into effect, and wanted to kind of go back as far as we possibly could. And then the applicants will only receive the amount once we are working with their landlord or mortgage company, what they are potentially short on their rent payment, not necessarily the whole rent payment. So with that, I know that Chris is on, but I also believe Michelle Brown is on. So if they have anything additional they want to add to this, I'd welcome their thoughts.
I will defer to Michelle. Jason, thank you.
And Michelle, I'm not sure if you are on a phone or if you are logged in through Teams. If you are on a phone, press *6. Otherwise, you're muted.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to let you know that we have a system in place that can very quickly, when all the terms are set by the municipality, have this money, have appointments set for folks and have this money moving. We just want to make sure that we, given what you've heard today of so much kind of almost oppressive things happening in the community and great anxiety, I just want to let you know we've got the partnerships in place and the systems in place to move these funds when all the terms are set. And I just can't tell you the tenor of the calls that we get at 211 of people who feel like they're drowning, they're in the middle of fires, and this kind of support gives them a great sense of relief, even if it's short term. We actually, since that slide was done, I just want to update it. We're now up to 389 households having been served, which is 1,219 individuals, and we have seen people from 37 different sectors in our economy. So this is pretty pervasive in its impact. And happy to take any questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Chris, did you want to add anything before I go to questions?
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. All right. So I think we can take a few questions if folks are okay going a little bit late. Ms. Solotel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So my question is, when we passed the original resolution, did it include mortgage assistance as well, or is that a change in the nature of the relief?
Through the chair, Assemblymember Zalatel, it is not a change. We are trying to, rental and mortgage assistance doesn't necessarily roll off the tongue. So I think when we were discussing it a couple of weeks ago, I think we probably failed in fully explaining it by just referring to it as rental assistance. But as we have kind of talked about it, there is the need on the other end as well. So that is kind of where we've landed on both rental and mortgage assistance.
Thank you. Mr. Weddleton.
Oh, thanks. So I guess working backwards to how much we'd be helping. So with $1 million, we could help about 500 renters. And that's not really nearly what we're hearing the problem is, but it's not insignificant either. It's not a small drop in the bucket for at least a couple months. So that's nice to see. Thanks. Check my math.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Any other questions or comments? Okay, I guess we'll look forward to seeing how this pilot program plays out and any further evolution of this program. I assume, much like the small business nonprofit relief fund, that we will get some reporting back on that. With that, I will go ahead and just thank everyone for attending today. So a big thank you to Gabe and Chris from Cook Inlet Housing Authority, to Daniel from the Alaska Housing Finance Corporation, Rob and Patrick from RollCap, Josh from the Board of Realtors, Drew from the Anchorage Home Builders Association, Nicole from ALSC, Michael from the Anchorage Tenants Union, Ryan and Greg from Widener, and Cassandra from the Landlord's Almanac. Thank you all for presenting. Really great discussion, and look forward to our future discussions. Have a good weekend, everyone.
You too.